this session on feminism and queer politics in India. My name is Beth Armand, I'm going to be chairing. Camilla is going to be doing the bulk of the session. I'm not going to try and do any kind of lead off because I don't know anything about this, so I'll just pass over to you.
Okay, can I have my pen?
Oh, sorry.
It's a comfort thing. Okay, so I'm Camilla Bassi. I'm a member of Workers' Liberty, have been for about 20 years now, and I'm also a human geography lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. And as Beth said, today I'm going to be talking about feminism and gay politics in India. So I want to start with a quote. In the preface to the first edition, the first German edition of Capital Volume 1 by Karl Marx, he says the following: "We suffer not only from the development of capitalist production, but also from the incompleteness of that development. Alongside of modern evils, a whole series of inherited evils oppress us, arising from the passive survival of antiquated modes of production, with their inherited train of social and political anachronisms." In this context, he states, we suffer not only from the living, but from the dead. And I suppose I want that quote to sort of hover over us, really, as I speak for the next 20 minutes or so. So what I want to do in my lead-off is I want to weave together past and present conditions, forces and struggles of existence into a narrative about feminism and gay politics in India, or more specifically into a story about the country's burgeoning sexual revolution. I'll start with some history because I'm interested in how history reverberates into the present. So let's start with the kiss. Although there's no definitive proof as to the origin of the kiss, ancient Indian Vedic Sanskrit texts, which date back to 1500 BC, appear to discuss kissing. The Mahabharata, one of the two major Sanskrit epics of ancient India, the other of which is the Ramayana, which I'll mention in a little bit more detail later. The Mahabharata, composed sometime between 3000 and 1500 BC, describes the act of kissing, and the Kama Sutra, which probably dates back to the 2nd century, has a whole chapter on styles of kissing. There's a body of anthropological research which suggests that the Greeks learnt about erotic kissing from India when Alexander the Great's armies conquered parts of Punjab in 326 BC. From as early as the 4th century, Hindu temples across India had carvings that depicted same-sex couples having sex. There's a version of a foundational text of the Hindu religion known as I've mentioned, the Ramayana, which was produced from the 14th century, and that references a sexual encounter between two women, and the Kama Sutra has direct references to gay sex. I guess I want to make a very basic point here, and it's this, that sex was not taboo in ancient Indian culture. For sure, a strain of intolerance to, for example, homosexuality long existed in pre-colonial India. Indeed, sometimes this intolerance was violent intolerance. So, for example, during the Mughal era, through particular interpretations and enactments of Islamic law. Research does indicate that it was the British colonial period, so we're talking 1858 to 1947, that developed this strain from a minor force into a dominant force. The academic Wendy Doniger observes the following: in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, India's downhill sexual journey began. The British came with preconceptions about Orientals, who were seen as over-erotic and actually feminine in a way that made them supposedly unfit to govern. So for Indians wanting to progress within this system, she argues, showing yourself to be asexual or anti-sexual or puritanical also showed yourself to be fit to run your own country. If we fuse this with Hinduism's emphasis on celibacy, the writer Catherine Tidrick impressively documents the father of the nation, the so-called father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi's regressive views and practices on sex and sexuality, specifically Gandhi's ever more bizarre and actually frankly suspect experiments with brahmacharya, in which he tested himself and through which he supposed that wider political outcomes were in the balance. Catherine Tidrick shows that that Gandhi's views and practices on sex and sexuality weren't simply rooted in Hinduism, but also in late Victorian England and Gandhi's contact with currents of esoteric Christianity and theosophy. A definitive law that both conceptualises and criminalises homosexuality within the framework of Victorian morality was introduced by the British Raj into India in 1860, and it was known as Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. The author Ira Trivedi historicises the conditions of existence for marriage and sexuality in 21st century India in an ancient Hindu code of conduct known as the Manusmriti, which includes, amongst 8 forms of marriage, the following: the right of Rakshasa, that is the forcible abduction of a woman by a man, and the right of Rishis, the father giving away his daughter in exchange for something of value. Scholars have convincingly argued that it's the Manusmriti which categorises women as the property of fathers and husbands. In this context, the academic Charu Gupta observes intimacy is seen as very much part of the private sphere, and even there it is meant for procreation and not pleasure. So I think there is actually an interesting conclusion that we can draw here about how the past shapes the present. On the one hand, we have a legacy left by the British Raj and its Victorian moral standards. So, for example, the Raj destroyed much temple art that depicted sexual intercourse, and it banished a history of sexual intimacy and liberalness that was intrinsic to, a significant strand of ancient Indian culture. On the other hand, there are pre-colonial currents that have long existed within Islamic and Hindu religions, which have held reactionary views towards sex, sexuality, and the social position of women, which has flourished hand in hand with this colonial legacy. So I'll leave that history there for now, and we'll kind of return to it actually in a later part of my talk. What I want to move on to now is a consideration of the feminist and gay rights movement. The roots of India's women's movement lie in the pre-Indian independence movement, but my focus today is on the late 20th century onwards. And in this period, the feminist movement in the country has been marked by certain atrocities that have sparked waves of campaigning that have led to social and legal changes. So notably, the following 5 cases and associated waves. So firstly, the Mathura rape case. In March 1972, a 16-year-old tribal girl called Mathura was raped by 2, possibly 3 policemen at a police station in the state of Maharashtra. She had gone to the police station to report the harassment by her brother for her having a boyfriend. The local sessions court determined that it was consensual sex and acquitted the 2 policemen. However, the Bombay High Court overturned this judgment, but then the Supreme Court of India went on to, once again, acquit the 2 policemen. The judge at the time said, because she was used to sex, she might have incited the cops to have intercourse with her. There was outrage over the Mathura rape case from public and feminist campaigners, such outrage which led to tougher rape legislation in the country. So specifically legislation in 1983, which stated that if a rape victim says that she did not consent to sexual intercourse, then the court should presume likewise. And also the legislation for the first time recognised custodial rape that happens within custody. The second wave came through the death of Tarvinder Kaur. In June 1979, around 200 women, students, housewives, working women marched through the streets of Delhi, protesting the dowry death of Tarvinder Kaur. The protesters went on to demand reform in marriage and dowry laws. 24-year-old Tarvinder was newly married and she was burnt to death for an inadequate dowry. In a dying statement, she said that her mother-in-law had poured kerosene over her while her sister-in-law had set her alight. The police registered the incident as a case of suicide. The third wave within the feminist movement was sparked by the act of sati, which is the live cremating of a widow on her husband's funeral pyre against Roop Kavar. In September 1987, in a village in Rajasthan, Roop Kavar was burnt alive in an act of sati. None of the spectators responded to her pleas for help. At the time of her death, Roop was 18 years old and she'd been married for just 8 months. The protest that followed the incident led to the 1987 Commission of Sati Prevention Act. The fourth incident or atrocity that sparked a wave was the gang rape of Banvari Devi. Banvari Devi was working for the Rajasthani government's Women's Development Programme, and in 1992 she was gang raped in retaliation for her trying to prevent men marrying off a baby girl of just 9 months old. Feminist groups in Rajasthan and in Delhi in particular responded vociferously. In 1995, the district sessions judge in the case pronounced that the rape couldn't have occurred because upper caste men wouldn't rape a Dalit woman. There was huge nationwide campaigning in relation to this case, and it was a landmark moment for India's feminist movement. However, justice has never been delivered for Banvari. Arguably, the most significant landmark of the feminist movement was in relation to the gang rape of a student on a bus in Delhi on the night of the 16th of December 2012, which I'm sure most, if not all, people in the room have read about. A couple of outcomes were especially worth noting in terms of the protest that came from that. One was the Burma Committee report. Although not all of the progressive recommendations of the Burma Committee report were followed through into law, such as recognising marital rape. And the second outcome was a modest but significant shift in the public zeitgeist that happened as a result of the outrage and the following protests. As the independent journalist Naya Dixit observed from the protests at the time, for the first time we heard words like patriarchy being discussed in the streets and in the mainstream media. Okay, so in contrast to the feminist movement, the gay rights movement in India seems to be in its infancy. There are small pockets of activism that exist around the country, most notably in urban areas. And the major cities of India do have annual gay pride marches and gay scenes. In 2009, as a result of the NAS Foundation, which is a gay rights and HIV/AIDS advocacy NGO, as a result of NAS Foundation filing a lawsuit 8 years previously, in 2009, the Delhi High Court ruled that Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, that criminalised homosexuality and was introduced by the British colonialists, the Delhi High Court ruled that Section 377 violated the Indian constitution, so homosexuality was decriminalised. A nationwide poll soon after this decriminalisation recorded that 73% of those polled said that they believed homosexuality should be illegal. A coalition of conservative religious and political organisations appealed the Delhi High Court's decision to the Supreme Court of India. And in December 2013, the Supreme Court of India overturned a 2009 decision recriminalising homosexuality. Here, I want to pause, I suppose, and draw a couple of observations vis-à-vis the feminist movement and gay politics in the country. The academic Ratna Kapoor states the following: with the opening up of the market, women are more visible in the workplace. That they are entering male bastions of power has challenged the sense of superiority and entitlement of the traditional Indian male. The idea of the woman as a fully formed human subject remains a difficult concept to embrace. Son preference simultaneously erodes the possibility of respect for women as girls are sinners unwanted or burdensome. Such inequalities produce the very hatred against women in the public arena that we are witnessing throughout the country. Kapoor concludes, as women assert their identity and enter his bastions of power, the traditional Indian male is reacting with violence. And the writer Ira Trivedi observes the following: India is undergoing a sexual revolution of sorts, of which the fight for LGBT rights is only one part. As a result of technological, economic and political changes during the past decade, India is witnessing a dramatic shift in values related to sex and sexuality. According to Shaif Ali Sadia, a professor at the Alder School of Professional Psychology in Chicago, who's researched sexuality and marriage in India, around 75% of young people polled in urban areas reported having sex prior to marriage. And in 2012, a survey conducted by Outlook, a leading magazine in India, reported 30% of Indian city dwellers found nothing wrong with homosexuality. Globalisation, which we could briefly define as time-space compression. I think the globalisation of the past 20 to 25 years, like everything in capitalism, is dialectical. What we have, I think, is a new phase of capitalism, which has given birth to contradictory tensions that have long been pregnant and kicking. Globalisation is an interplay of forces, forces demanding the future, and forces heralding the past. It straddles, if you like, static and motion. Remember Karl Marx and that quote from the beginning, "We suffer not only from the living but from the dead." So the globalising space of 21st century India occupies several centuries at once. Son preference, underage marriage, arranged marriage, dowry demands, gender unequal malnutrition, female feticide, female infanticide, sex trafficking, violence against women, rape, urbanisation and capitalist development, the mass entry of women into the workforce and the expansion of information and communications technology seems to have generated, I think, city spaces and conditions of existence in which we are having a collision, a head-on collision, a social and political collision between an old feudalistic, religious and patriarchal India and an aspiring new generation India. On the one hand, we have the ruling party of the BJP and its student wing, ABVP, and its fascistic ally, Shiv Sena, which indicates the flourishing of a deeply unpleasant and reactionary and dangerous religious fundamentalism that is both fuelled by and affronted by globalisation. On the other hand, we have the protesters who came forth in response to the Delhi gang rape, who came forth in response to the recriminalisation of homosexuality in 2013. Two movements, two very recent movements, I think illustrate this collision especially well. Love Jihad and Kiss of Love. Love Jihad is a myth that has been propagated by the Hindu right, that young Muslim men are seducing young Hindu women for conversion to Islam. Love Jihad has fuelled communal tension and violence in the country, and emboldened by Narendra Modi's election to power, India is witnessing, since last year, since 2014, a spike in the propaganda campaign of Love Jihad, which is led by the Hindu nationalist and extremist paramilitary organisation RSS. Kiss of Love is a protest movement which originated in Kerala in October 2014 and spread thereafter to other parts of urban India. One of its founders, Rahul Pasipalan, describes what Kiss of Love is and its politics. "We started the Kiss of Love in Kerala because it defies moral policing and all sorts of attacks on democratic rights, and it celebrates the right not just of individuals to kiss, but of communities to defy hate and embrace each other, of women and all people to freely decide who to love and marry, and of all citizens to resist fatwas of the kind issued by the Taliban, the Nats, the RSS alike. Let us remember that the Taliban found it obscene, immoral for Malaya to go to school. The Nats find it obscene for girls to have mobile phones. The ABVP finds love itself obscene and therefore protests against Valentine's Day. The followers of the same right-wing thoughts attacked a restaurant downtown because they believed young people spending time there were being immoral." I should pause from the quote just briefly to explain that. Downtown's a cafe where Hindu fundamentalists attacked this cafe because there were reports that there were young people inside kissing, and that was the original spur to the Kiss of Love movement. Rahul Pasipalan continues, "The obscenity law, section 292 in India, is a product of the British colonial period, where the rulers were guided by Victorian morality. The right wing have to understand that so-called culture is not static. It is something which keeps changing according to the financial and social lifestyle of a society. Next time, before you start talking about Indian culture, please spend a few minutes reviewing history. The worst part is that the right-wing goons that indulged in sexual harassment with the protesters at the Kiss of Love event. These goons taunted protesters, demanded kisses and sex, branded the women there as sluts. They asked the male protesters to send your sisters to us. They don't get it, do they? Women who kiss a person of their choice are not public property to kiss right-wing men on demand, and sisters are not the property of brothers to be handed over to other men. The Kiss of Love events in urban India have included women kissing men kissing men, and women kissing women. It appears to be an extraordinary fusion of feminism and gay rights under a wider social and political demand for sexual freedom. All of the events have been actual head-on collisions with right-wing religious forces, with the police more often than not detaining under a notion of protecting the Kiss of Love protesters. I think what we have in India right now is a layer of young, urban, educated, socially mobile women and men, straight and gay, that are demanding freedoms and rights over their bodies, over their sexualities and their genders, and the public spaces of their cities. And they're courageously taking on the state and religious fundamentalists in a contestation over what it means to be Indian, and over a contestation of Indian culture. And it's an extraordinary chapter, I think, in the country's history. I'm going to leave it there. I've got some other comments to make, but I think I'll leave that for my concluding remarks. So, okay.
Cool. I've just got a note to say that we can go on until 10 to 3. So we've got an hour. So if anyone wants to say anything, you can. I'm not saying talk as long as you want, because that'll be annoying. But you can have you can do some long contributions if you want. Has anyone got anything that you'd like to contribute? You'll have to keep talking to Camilla. Anyone wants to say anything?
You have questions for us? You're good at. Camilla's quite good at giving questions.
Thanks. Yeah.
Give us some stuff.
When I was thinking about that dialectic between static and motion, and how when I read about some of what's going on in urban India in terms of this collision between forces heralding the past and forces demanding the future, there's something about urban India that I'm finding very inspiring and politically progressive in a way that it isn't being reflected in the diaspora of India. And what I mean by that is, the populations that, emigrated out of India in the 50s and 60s and set up, in countries like this. And so I think about my own extended family, and I think, okay, that struggle that's happening in urban India is something that is, that's where the motion is. That's where, maybe if anyone's got any experiences of, living in the Indian or Pakistani or Bangladeshi diaspora in this country or elsewhere, just some thoughts on that. What's the situation, vis-a-vis feminism, gay rights in this country, if we're, British, but also of an Indian subcontinent origin.
Rosie?
Okay, I'll answer that one.
Great.
It's not like it was. My family, my dad's side of the family, Anglo, moved over here in the 50s. So it did feel like it was a little bit of a question for me, but I'm sure there's lots of other people in the room who've got other experiences similar. And I think actually what you said about culture being static or moving depending, and the way that changes with the spread of diaspora around the world is something that I've known about through my own family, but I've never really considered before, and actually it's a really interesting point. So my dad always talks about the fact that because my family are mixed race, but culturally in India they were certainly part of the middle class, the kind of colonial class, even though they were mixed race, and that was, I don't know, it's an odd thing that it's a little bit too long to go into the way that certain classes within the Indian culture would kind of basically turn against other Indian people in that kind of colonial program. But one thing my dad always says is that when he moved over here, he found his own culture he'd been taught as he was brought up in India, which was to be incredibly old-fashioned compared to when he moved to East London, South East London. They moved to Charlton in the 50s, and he was bullied and had a complete there's a kind of cultural schism between himself and other people of his age, because the culture that he had was, he calls it a Victorian culture, because when white colonial officers went over to India, they took the Victorian culture with them and imposed that throughout India and kept it static, because that was one way of kind of keeping power. Now, the UK developed while people were in India, and yet those values, my grandparents came over here with those kind of Victorian values when they came back to the UK, a generation or so later, and they were no longer relevant to the UK. That's something that actually is really interesting, because also there was there's a wave of migration of Indian people and people from the subcontinent to leave and come to the UK, to Europe in the 50s and 60s, and whether those cultures reflect what the development in those countries now. I think it's an interesting point. Are there more traditional values within the kind of Asian communities in the UK, for example, than there are actually within India? I think that there's certainly an idea in this country that there's quite a homogenous culture, for example, for Indian families, and I don't think that when I think of India, I don't see that. I see a vast breadth of highly conservative cultures in some certain communities, but also in urban centres, women kind of becoming very independent and quite liberated. Got a lot of professional women in India as part of the kind of technological revolution in the big urban centres, and women being involved in that kind of professional class in India. So, but I'm not sure if that's the same as the vision we have of British Indian people. I'm not sure it's necessarily, obviously young people in this country who are from Indian backgrounds do take part in all of those things, but I certainly think that the vision that we might have here is maybe a bit more traditional and less varied. But is that a problem of, the kind of the white British vision of Asian communities? Is it actually reality? I don't know.
Sorry, I don't know your name at the back. Do you have your hand up?
No.
Is it me?
Yeah.
Hi. I've noticed this really startling development ever since what happened in Rotherham when the Asian community was exposed to what it did. After 30-something years of being in this country, I suddenly have been counted ever since Rotherham. I can date it back to the time of now being harassed by Indian men, and it is as if because Rotherham was made to be a race issue and not an issue against all women. So now I think Indian men feel safe, that it's safer to harass Asian women as opposed to white women. And I was actually followed from a train station late one night by an Asian man. And I went back, and the guard who reached the train station was an Asian man, and I thought, God, is he going to believe me? But he did, thank God. And he confronted this chap who had been following me, and the chap immediately brought up religion, Muslim. I wouldn't do this to my Muslim sister. And I'm not Muslim, I'm Anglican. But then that sort of harassment on a weekly basis just, muddles my mind. Because then I start thinking, God, yeah, there's a huge problem in the Asian community of harassment. There's no doubt about that. But then I'm not being harassed by the Sri Lankan men on Tamil. It's the Muslim. So then I start thinking racist thoughts because I am being victimized. It just does my head, basically.
Rita?
Yes, if you've already actually brought it up, but I was thinking about the
Can you speak a tiny bit louder?
Just a little bit louder.
Okay, so basically, like, obviously, like, I was sort of like, I lived a bit in Pakistan. Obviously, I was very young when I left, but then a lot of my family still live there. But there's obviously a very sort of in Pakistan, quite different sort of like elements that work in that we have a real problem with religious fundamentalism and actually Islamic terrorism, which actually is obviously very depressive. But even upon like even sort of upon like a sort of like relatively like middle class is sort of people, this idea of like I suppose about like homosexuality or bisexuality, all of these things are extremely taboo. Like if I like even like when I spoke with my parents, what if I would like to have a relationship with a woman, they would like they may not react amazingly negatively, but they kind of have that disapproving look in their eye. And what I suppose what my point is that is there like when I suppose whenever I think particularly in Pakistan, whenever you are making a positive statement about different sexualities, you have to put yourself on the line and say and have to say that I'm going against religious fundamentalism. And when religious fundamentalism is an extremely powerful force, like for example, there's this Pakistani designer dude who basically said something about one of the wives of the Prophet, and it was quite a sexist comment, but they basically said that he was blasphemous, and they put a fatwa on him, and they basically have to go. He has to live in England now. So whenever so I'm wondering, like, when there is such a massive oppressive apparatus that's way of religious fundamentalists who more often will not have arms, have bombs, will not hesitate in basically killing you or killing your family. Like, how can you make the same form of sort of positive expression of your sexuality in that kind of environment?
Do you want to come back? On any of that?
Yeah, maybe take a couple more comments and I'll come back.
Yeah, does anyone else want to say anything? Omar?
Okay, just trying to find a poll that I read, I found a couple of years ago from Thomson's Reuters, just like news people, and it was a poll I found very interesting. It was a poll of a list of countries in the sort of developing world and the developed world, Western world, that ranked how well life is for women. And India was at the bottom of it. It was about like 20 or 30 countries, and it was lower than Saudi Arabia as well. And you know, if someone says to me, you know, where are the worst countries in the world for women, India wouldn't come to mind. Other countries would come to mind. So I found it very interesting. And when I started thinking about it, I thought, in Saudi Arabia, women can't drive, they can't vote, and in India they can. It seems to me that most of the reasons given was because things like job opportunities, things like the ability to control your own wealth, things like that, differ markedly. Probably not just within rural and urban parts of India, but probably within giant states in India. I mean, India's such a vast country, you have 1 billion people. It's really hard to compare, I would imagine. The northern part of the country with like Tamil Nadu, it's like comparing France with Poland, rather than looking at one country in its own. But basically what I wanted to say was, how in a country like India can struggles be done on a big national level, especially when there's such differences between states, and there's such, and how do women in the rural areas who don't have life, don't have the experiences, don't have the opportunities that women in Mumbai or Delhi have, how do they organise themselves?
Anyone got any questions?
Wasn't a question.
No, it's fine.
A following from your point, Sarah, to catching me. I don't know how relevant this is, but it's just from kind of what you were saying about having like your family who like a few decades ago. And I mean, like as like a British Indian who's grown up here, like I've grown up here my whole life, and well, my parents aren't from India, they're from Kenya. They moved here over like 40 years ago, and I kind of feel like, yeah, sorry, I'm not phrasing this correctly, but like part of me is like, you know, coming to events like these, or like when I was a student, like learning about sort of violence against women in India, or like taking an Islamic law module. You know, part of me wants to learn about Indian history and learn about like the history of like my grandparents when they were in India, and you know, see my culture for what it is, where I kind of come from in that sense. But I feel like living here, like you have this kind of conflict, because part of you is, like part of me is, I'm like a westernised woman, I've grown up here my whole life. Sorry if this offends anyone, but yeah, my friends call me a coconut. Like, you know, and then part of me is wanting to please my family, and they have certain expectations. They're quite liberal and open-minded and understand that I'll do my own thing anyway. They can say what they want, but they know I won't listen to them all the time. So I don't know, it's not really a major point, but I feel like just to kind of say like how I see myself living in this country based on like my background and my culture and my family's background, it's always a conflict between trying to like do what you want and makes you happy, and like please other people around you, and
I think it's really interesting as well, the point you made about being labelled a coconut. It's almost as if it's that whole idea of if you do sort of adopt another culture, so that idea of culture being static as well, and bringing that culture from another country, but then if you start to, you know, adopt the culture of the country you're in, then you lose your definition. Sort of you're no longer maybe an Indian, for example, and so it's part of that is maybe that's why it is static. Maybe that's why sometimes when people migrate over to a country, they hold on to that old culture to define themselves, and it's a safe and kind of secure place for them. Whereas, again, when you start adopting maybe a new culture, then you lose who you are somehow, your cultural reference, you know.
Yeah, I mean, like, you put it in better words than I can, like, it's like we say, culture is like constantly evolving, reacting. It's not static, and you know, like in my opinion, it's constantly reacting to forces around it, and like it's whatever you make it to be, really. It's like people expect things from you. They're like, oh, an Indian girl shouldn't be doing that. You shouldn't be doing something like that. You should be out drinking. You shouldn't be out smoking, whatever. And like, you're part of. You don't live in a vacuum. You're part of like the society around you. So you adapt to things. Like I'm a certain way because I've lived here my whole life, and then I've got parents who, you know, like I'm a reaction to all these external factors around me, and it's difficult sometimes just trying to like please everyone, or like not please everyone, or just say fuck you, like whatever.
Do you want to take some more hands?
Take some more hands.
Rita, have you got a hand up? Yeah.
Following on from that, my experience is slightly different in that rather than feeling a conflict between where I am and where I come from, I don't really feel as if I belong anywhere. I don't really feel westernized enough, and like no one who actually talks to me frequently or anything would ever feel that I was British because I just talk about like Pakistan and stuff. I just basically my diet. I have a complete distaste for pretty much all the high-tech English people food or Goa people food, but I don't really make. But then at the same time, I don't have the values of like Pakistan at all, because I did live there for a while, but I moved here when I was basically quite young. But actually it kind of feels that rather than having, I don't feel as if I actually have a culture, which is why I find a lot of I find a lot of like discussion about culture and cultural appropriation really quite weird, in the sense that I don't really feel culture is this thing that is set in stone from my experience. I mean, for me, my culture was just basically taking the bits I like from Pakistan, which is the food, which is the salwar and stuff like that, and just taking the bits I like from Britain and then just making it my own. Like I think that particularly, I think there is a process of appropriation, but I think it's a process of capitalist appropriation in which basically you have exploited people's works who are already marginalized being used for profit. But then on a personal level, I don't think the same often applies. Like I don't really feel a lot of rage when I see, for example, a white girl wearing a sari, because I just think that's all. Yeah, like I personally like it because the thing is I wear Western clothes all the time, and I think it's kind of because considering white people in general, when they colonized India and Pakistan and all of that, they basically tried to destroy our culture. I find it kind of amusing that they kind of want to have some of it now. Of course, the processes in which they do it aren't always right, and they aren't all, and I think the relationships are often exploitative. But I think the idea of taking bits of culture and making them your own, I don't fundamentally have a problem with that.
Liam?
Yeah, just on the point of capitalist globalization and the universalism of universalizing of market-dependent relationships and how capitalism is encroaching into pre-capitalist, pre-colonial, patriarchal relationships in India. It creates, I suppose, it's a form of social but also cultural and even combined development, which on the one hand destroys, I suppose, Orientalism in both forms, both the racist assumptions that the West has of the East, but also the other way of looking at things where in some subaltern and post-colonial thinking that it's impossible to understand both West and East in the same terms or in terms that are translatable between the two things. I think the example of Victorian colonial homophobia that you started with, and also the example of more liberal elements in traditional Indian thought and religion shows that actually homophobia is not just something that we have in countries that are insufficiently developed by some measure or other. But liberality and sexual liberality isn't something that our culture, whatever that means, can be proud of. That's not. Both of these things are derived from more universal, fundamental, human values, and I think the time-space compression of globalization is kind of making that point, and it allows us to sort of see these struggles as actually part of the same, the same global struggle that we have as workers, as secularists, as Democrats. We don't have to invent a new language to discuss these things just because they're happening in India or Pakistan or in Bangladesh. We can actually frame these things as being part of a collective struggle with important differences, obviously.
Luke?
Yeah, I think these discussions are really important because you can find people all the time who are feminism isn't relevant anymore, sexual liberation isn't a problem, and you also find people who are the working class isn't a thing anymore. But I think the very very easy way to discuss the reality is look at India, look at the developing, look at capitalism and development elsewhere, and actually you can then understand the tendency much better, which is women's oppression, sexual oppression, and workers' oppression are still the defining characteristics of capitalism internationally. I think that's why it's important to discuss it.
Rosie?
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you said about what's your name?
That's me.
Yeah. What's your name?
I'm Bida.
Okay. So you said that you don't feel like you fit in anywhere. Yeah, I was thinking about where does the when you have these definitions of different groups, cultural groups, and they come from lots of places, but like largely in terms of what you're talking about, for me, they come from race, and they come from racism. Initially, certainly, like the reason why we have certain ideas about different groups they come from racist stereotypes originally, but then they are reinforced in different ways by anti-racism. So we have, people will historically have been attacked on a racist basis, and therefore will kind of reclaim their culture and say, no, this is our positive identity as a group, which is a huge part of the anti-racist movement. But then I was sort of wondering, where do you fit in if you are part of a diasporic group? You don't necessarily, you have elements in your own culture that are not purely from the country, for example, that your family are from, and you take on elements of the country that your family moved to and so on. And is that almost, are you betraying your heritage? Are you betraying your kind of that anti-racist movement? Because there are activists, there have been groups of activists who, in part of anti-racist movements, have said, they will stick very closely to like a traditional cultural heritage in order to kind of, as a political statement. But if you don't see that as being your own heritage, because it's a mixture, which is the case for an awful lot of people, then it's not simple, and I can kind of understand why people feel like they don't necessarily fit in. And it's certainly something that you hear, I think, from people who are mixed race, and you think, well, it's not simple, it's just, you can't just call me black, you can't just call me white, because both of those things, and yet kind of you're neither, because, as I said, people kind of want you to make a political statement about being one or the other, and you say, I'm both or neither. So I think that's quite an interesting thing, and a lot to think about there. And I guess there are new cultural categories, aren't there? Like British Asian. British Asian is a thing. Like it's its own culture. It has its own kind of cinema. It has its own music. That exists. You have kind of. I used to live in Birmingham, and you go to like a mainstream club night, and the second room would always be like a Bangla room, and like that was like a Birmingham thing, like a British Asian thing, and that didn't exist in the same form in Asia. It was very specific. So, but I guess does making these new categories and stuff like that, is it helpful, or is it like reinforcing division of people? Like I kind of have a question mark, and obviously visually I'm white, so there's a question whether I'm not the best person to think about this, but making these new categories, it does help us understand ourselves, but also it does kind of create divisions as well, and I'm not sure reclaiming culture is an anti-racist act, but you said cultural appropriation, and the idea of it is something you have a problem with, and I agree. I don't kind of sign up to the kind of group of people that say that cultural appropriation is I don't tend to say cultural appropriation is a really bad thing. I think it's a really complicated conversation to have. I mean, power is very important. Power is very important in that conversation. It's involved in that. So that's why we should continue to have that conversation. But when you talk about white women wearing sari, I think that's that's something that people say. It's offensive. You have the power to just do that. And Indian women didn't have the power to reject colonialism and so on. But I suppose in an ideal world, without power, then culture would be quite kind of fluid. So maybe the idea of reclaiming your culture and keeping your cultural categories is a form of resistance that we should stick with while that power exists. It's really complicated.
Sorry, I don't know your name.
Julia. I just one question. With regards to women, I'm speaking to one of my friends, this is kind of anecdotal, but she's Indian, and she was saying that at a certain point, although it's a patriarchal society, at a certain point, it's almost like her grandma became the head of the family. So there's kind of a matriarchy. And I just wondered about the idea of also women perpetuating this. You spoke about, it was the mother-in-law and the sister-in-law that this lady spoke about earlier on. And the idea of women being extremely powerful as well in these households and actually perpetuating that. But then also the idea of women, my friend was saying to me that in her mum's opinion and her grandma's opinion, that actually pain is part of a woman's life. So pain is part of an Indian woman's life. That's a rite of passage, or you must go through that. And I just find that very interesting.
Stephen and then Kathy and then do you want to, because sorry, I know you've written loads of notes there.
So it's really, I mean, when the kind of the gang rape on the bus happened, I'm thinking that was under a Congress government, wasn't it? And since there's obviously been an election. So I just wondered what kind of change that, whether there's been anything, the kind of progress that came, well, potential progress that maybe came out of that in terms of people's realisation about the situation for women in India, whether there's been kind of reversals of that, and maybe whether kind of any gains there have kind of stayed, and what the kind of situation would be now, and then also how people who, the kind of, I don't know, traditional organised trade unions or other protest movements that would say protest against Modi or government policies in general, like you would, how they relate to the kind of sexual kind of revolution kind of groups, and whether it's the case that I imagine the leadership of the kind of Indian trade unionists or the kind of traditional Indian left, which I know very little about, beyond you hear about kind of insurgent Maoist groups in the mainstream media, but that's it, and I know it's not just that. So how they relate to these groups, and whether the groups kind of embracing kind of queer politics and feminism see themselves as wanting to relate to the kind of traditional protest movements, or whether they want to kind of be quite separate from them and kind of inculcate any kind of exchange, and whether there has been any kind of exchange of ideas, because obviously like Modi's incredibly, obviously won the election, but a very divisive figure. So is there a kind of coalition of people who would all want to get rid of Modi, and are there people that would not want to therefore link up with the kind of sexual revolutionaries in order to kind of fight any kind of campaign against conservatism, because they might be against kind of, you know, what is effectively far right kind of Hindu nationalism, but they don't want to go along with people who also hate far right Hindu nationalism, who happen to be gay, or, you know, in favour of like public displays of affection. So it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about that.
Kathy?
Three sort of quick points and a question. First, it's a question which is about, so related to what Stephen was saying, is how this is spreading out, you know, LGBT politics or feminist politics, because what you described was a city movement, an urban movement, and obviously urban environments concentrate all the sort of social forces, and you know, capitalist development sort of speeds up within the city. And so you described a particular layer of people who are either working, you know, working class in the sense they're working class or middle class. And, you know, you have to have a bit of money, don't you, to go and sit in a cafe, whether you kiss or drink coffee, or tea, or whatever you drink. But you do have to have a bit of money. But obviously, you know, there's tremendous wealth inequality in the city, and class inequality in the city. So, you know, you're not really describing a kind of how, you know, is any of this kind of spreading to working class people? You know, wider layers of working class people. So that was my question. And then a couple of quick comments. This business about women in households, I think it's so important, but it's one of the universal things I think about women's oppression. Across cultures, across countries, across classes even, about women, you know, it's the idea that women have a separate sphere, and that women's existence is within kinship groups and within families, and you know that's women's sphere of existence historically, and it's still embedded even in a very modern world that we live in, and it's something that it just, you know, happens, I think, in all families, and it's worth thinking about.
and it does perpetuate, I think, divisions between men and women. Then and the other comment about cultural appropriation, you see, another way of thinking about this is that sari was sewn by someone, was made by somebody, and made for a very, very small amount of money, probably, if anything. You know, it could even have been made by virtual slave labour. We don't know, but it ends up somewhere in the world and is put on by somebody. And whether it's put on, you know, whoever it's put on is still, you know, the result of somebody's labour, which wasn't properly recognised. And so, isn't it our job? Isn't that the more important thing in a way? And isn't it our job to sort of bring that out, bring that reality out, and talk about that reality? And I think that's the big thing about cultural appropriation that's going on in the world at the moment, because markets are so invasive in the world. There's all sorts of people doing kind of artisanal, women a lot of time, doing artisanal things for very, very small amounts of money that are kind of part, you know, whether it be you come from a Mayan culture or from an Indian culture, for a Palestinian culture or something, doing little bits and bobs, making things and then selling them on the world market for very, you know, for huge amounts of money for middle class people to consume, basically. So I think that reality is kind of more important in a way, but maybe people want to disagree with that, because that might be just looking at it very economistic.
Cool. Do you want to get going?
Yeah, I'll get going. Thanks, Beth. So maybe 4 points which I hope will cover everything that's been said or asked, and then I want to move on to my final remarks. So somebody said something quite early on about Rotherham, and yeah, the child sexual abuse that's happened in Rotherham, that's been uncovered in Rotherham, and the particular connection there to British Pakistani men. And I think, as a human geographer, it is worth recognising that there is geographical variation in women's oppression, and you can correlate that with capitalism. So whether a country's newly is in kind of early capitalist processes, is more advanced, you can correlate that to patriarchy. And I think we think about the Indian subcontinent. If we think about India, there is stark geographical variation in terms of the position of women within India. So my family originate from Punjab. Highest rates of female infanticide and female feticide in the world happen in Punjab. So northern India is particularly bad for women, and I think east and west Punjab, so in Pakistan as well. And I think it's finding an explanation for that, because I share, or not share, but I sympathise with what you were saying about I'm making judgments here about Pakistani men, and we exist in a climate where there's racism and all of that, but it's rooting the reactionary treatment, the derogatory treatment, the oppressive treatment of women within particular conditions of existence. So, and I think when it comes to violence against women, sexual violence against women, physical violence against women, there are conditions of existence in which capitalism and patriarchy views and provide some sort of explanation. I think we shouldn't shy away from saying that the treatment of women within British Pakistani communities can be especially bad. Second thing, 3 people, I'm sure, at least, asked the question or thereabout. There's some dire conditions for women within Pakistan and India, so how do you organise effectively for change? There's a fantastic, she might not be fantastic on everything, but she's, I think, India's top socialist feminist called Kavita Krishnan. But I believe she spoke in London a couple of times quite recently. And she's written a really interesting piece that I read quite recently about how the issue for women in India is one of autonomy. So, you know, the freedom whether to marry or not, the freedom to, you know, wear what you want and so on and so forth. And that was a really convincing argument. She's, you know, she's heavily engaged in the feminist movement. She's also heavily engaged in labour movement struggles in the country. And I've just said something there that is key, isn't it, to the effectiveness of feminism and gay politics in India. It needs to link up with class struggle. There are a number of obstacles to that. So sections of the Indian left that are, you know, hostile to feminist and gay politics. Some sections aren't, so Kavita Krishnan represents a current that isn't, but there are significant sections that are. So one section of the Indian left, in response to the December the 16th gang rape, had a position that was very similar to the Hindu right, which was rape's a problem of urban India, it's not a problem of Bharat, it's not a problem of traditional India, the villages and stuff. So we need to kind of, you know, we need to move away from a westernised, a globalising, overtly consumer capitalist society and retreat to the villages. And it's a kind of it's a Gandhi type, it's a Gandhi pseudo-socialism, I think. So that's the key. Synthesising, women's issues, LGBT struggles with labour movement struggles. And the labour movement in India, class struggle in India, is, it's very much alive. And I think, women workers are very militant in India. So it's not impossible, but I think one of the obstacles are sections of the Indian left. Congress was fairly ineffectual government, actually, heavily tarred with corruption, as all governments are. On paper, it was against the recriminalisation of homosexuality. BJP is a worse government in the sense that it is fueling and will happily turn a blind eye to Hindu fundamentalism, which is a huge problem in India and has been on the resurgence since this kind of latest phase of capitalism, globalisation. It's been on the resurgence since the 1990s. On identity, culture, I'd say read Lenin on the national question. Lenin had a great debate with the Jewish socialist organisation, the Bund, and somewhere within that debate he talked about culture as being kind of quite fluid and hybrid and talked about envisioning a culture, an internationalist culture that was very cosmopolitan. I define myself as an internationalist, European, British, Indian, a worker, a socialist, a feminist, a cyclist. I'm all those things, and in motion. So, but Lenin and the national question. Dare I say it? So. And your comment, I think it was, around women perpetuating, they do. I'm going to talk about some preference and dowry now, just to conclude. And I think Indian women, carry cultural shame and they carry cultural pain, and they are part of perpetuating, a highly oppressive patriarchal culture. And that's the messy reality of it, really. A recent study, I say recent, I think it came out this year, that was done in India on gender bias, revealed the following, which was kind of interesting findings. So the study reported that attitudes towards women's clothing, what we wear, people in urban areas are showing much more openness to what women wear. However, that's in marked contrast to rural areas where people still hold very regressive opinions. Women shouldn't wear jeans, things like that. Here's the finding that was disturbing. Sun preference remains stubbornly pervasive. across all sections of Indian society. There is very little variation when it comes to some preference across income, caste, class, education, and rural and urban areas. Add to this the widespread practice of the dowry, which was legally abolished in the country in 1961, and alarmingly evidence to suggest that dowry demands and dowry deaths are on the rise alongside the country's modernisation. It's estimated that 1 woman an hour in India dies of a dowry death. And I would conclude that some preference in the dowry, and surely the two are intimately connected, some preference in the dowry are classic examples of how forces of pre-capitalism and capitalism, in that dialectical way that I talked about, are both colliding and fusing in 21st century India. And I want to just spend a few minutes thinking about the dowry, the history of the dowry, and why it's found a new form of life of late. So the exact history of the dowry isn't something it seems that scholars agree on, but research does suggest that the dowry was fairly insignificant in ancient India, and with women during the ancient Indian period having some form of inheritance rights to property. The academic Sharashila provides the most fascinating historical account of the dowry. Well, I find it most fascinating, you might not, but I'm going to read at length this following account. He says, over time, from about 6th century BC to 5th century AD, the position of women in society began to deteriorate as the inheritance of land became a legal issue in an agrarian setting. It became important to say who had access to the land and who did not. The basic unit of agriculture, the joint family, came up with ways to secure its perpetuation and prevent land from getting subdivided and fragmented. And the caste system set the legal codes through which this was to be done. And of the religious works that codified the caste system, with its accompanying strictures on property rights and marriage practices, the most important was the Manusmriti, which I've aforementioned. Women were placed in the caste hierarchy with the lowest caste. Women could not carry on the family name. They left home at the time of marriage. They were perceived as sinful. It was the father's religious duty to marry off his daughter. And since they left the home at the time of marriage, they could not inherit property. And Sharashila notes this was especially important in a patrilocal agrarian economy. If the daughter inherited land, the land would leave the household and go to the new household. So he says what's critical in understanding how dowry was constituted as a custom is that in this Hindu system it was a woman's inheritance right, a portion of wealth that was hers to dispose of, her security against economic disaster. At the same time, social stature and respect were accorded to customs that involved giving gifts to the groom in situations where the bride had no say in choice of groom or indeed over her decision to marry. So the lines between property for the woman and gifts to the groom as a mark of respect and an inducement to marry started blurring. And this meant that the actual negotiation of the dowry and of marriage were taken outside of a woman's control. It's quite a lot in there, so you might not have got it all, but I'm happy to just give people the quote so they can digest it at a later point. So I think what we've got is what we've got everywhere in the world, because it's intrinsic to capitalism, ever-changing conditions and forces of existence, being driven by globalisation. And I'm thinking to that fantastic quote in the Communist Manifesto, which is still the best descriptor of globalisation. So, quoting Marx and Engels, all that is solid melts into air. And in conditions in which there is beginning to be a breaking up of traditional households, conditions which are generating rising consumerism, rising individualism, increasing economic inequality. The dowry is acquiring a new significance. So the academic Sharashila concludes that the dowry has become a weapon. It's become a way to extract fast wealth. It's become a way to cope with rising consumerism and to subjugate incoming brides within the household, lest the changes outside and within the household should lead these women to question the traditional division of rights and duties. So again, I started with that quote, didn't I, right at the beginning, which I've said twice now, but I'll no, I won't repeat it, but I'll repeat one aspect of the original quote. Alongside of modern evils, a whole series of inherited evils oppress us. I'll end it there. Thanks.
Well, we finished 10 minutes early. So